shocked you into submission. That's a joke, of course, but thank you so much, Sally. Can stand up and thank Sally for doing that. Come down here, Sally. Sally's a super multi-instrumentalist. You've done all sorts of things, and you just got a new recording coming out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's called Nightingale Floor, which Nightingale floors are floors in ancient Japanese castles, and when you walk on them, they squeak and they make the sound of nightingales. And the analogy is, in the same way, we've got to squeak and make noise, and there's a real environmental message behind it, which is the education of unsustainable palm oil. And it's an 11-piece string section with 3 improvising soloists, and Kate Nohaiki makes an appearance at the end in a pop song, and it's a website, so you go on the site and you can download and donate. Either there's 2 videos or the full 20-minute piece. I think that's about it.
What is it? Nightingale, it's FLOOR. Nightingale Floor, like this one, .com. Thanks, just .com.au. Sally Campbell, ladies and gents. You can go again with you. Oh, doesn't sound like that. I love it. Doesn't sound like that. Well, let's talk a little bit about the audience now as we start to wrap up today. The audience is an incredibly important part of performance. Sometimes I think performers aren't aware of just how important they are in terms of the energy that they bring to a concert, and sometimes that's not much. I'm not talking about you guys at all, but sometimes audiences come in grumpy, they sit, they cough, they eat lollies very loudly, they look bored. They get to the end of a symphony and they actually leave during the applause just to get to the car park or get the bus. And you know what? Here they come now. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. But it is important how energetic the audience are. I often think that a performance is like the 2 halves of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Each half is held up by the other. So if you have a really bad audience, it doesn't matter what you do on the stage, no magic is going to happen. Sometimes I've had the experience where the audience is almost too wound up for what you're about to do. Very unusual, but it did happen one New Year's Eve. It was the New Year's Eve of the millennium. the fake one, into 99 into 2000, not the real one, which happened a year later. And we were doing a New Year's Eve concert at the Sydney Opera House. They had produced it, we had an orchestra. It was a musical theatre night, a night of Stephen Sondheim. They'd chosen it because it was called You're Gonna Love Tomorrow. And they thought, what a great title for a New Year's Eve concert. I went round and looked round the corner of the stage into the concert hall, and there were 2,500 people doing Mexican waves. And we had to go out and then sing, Gods of the Theatre, smile on us. And eventually, though, they calmed down, and by the end of it, it was a great night. But that's one of the few times I've actually been terrified we might be lynched. But of course, lynching and all sorts of other activity was much more prevalent in the older days. We've become so polite in the concert hall. In order to gain admittance to a popular play, for instance, in 18th century London, you had to arrive at least an hour before the house opened. There were no queues, no individual numbered seats, so people rushed, particularly for the cheap seats in the pit, and people used to punch each other. There was serious injury to get in. And it was only in 1763 that audience members were banned from sitting on stage at Drury Lane. Also, of course, they didn't sit in the dark and the stage was brightly lit. Because of the gas lamps, everything was brightly lit, which meant you had to compete for the audience's attention, because half the time they were too busy chatting to themselves. I think we need more of that. I can't remember the last riot in a theatre in Australia. I do remember once the Australian Chamber Orchestra did a performance, and up the back one man shouted out, "Rubbish!" Wow. What we need more of is a storm. But as the sun comes out, you know, ladies and gentlemen, I think that things are actually better than we think. I think in the arts we tend to belittle our contribution. We often question our worth. We try to be so efficient. We squabble over small sums of money. It's almost as if we're embarrassed to say that we're worth it. And we are. Every day we're out there making people's lives better. And yet I think sometimes we feel guilty about that, about the small sums of money that it all costs. Particularly in relation to something like the Defence Department. I know this for a fact recently because I was talking to a friend who was a contractor working on a project which was to refit the HMAS Darwin. It's one of the frigates in the Australian Navy. And basically the whole thing had been falling apart. They had to repaint it. They discovered that in fact the whole ship had just been held together by paint. Sometimes the metal underneath it corroded completely, so they had to cut it out, put all the metal back in again. In fact, the way to get rid of the Australian Navy is just to throw mineral turps at it, and the whole thing would just dissolve into the sea. The original projected cost for this little exercise was $6 million, and guess what? It blew out by a factor of 600%. The whole thing cost $36 million, and that is more than the entire turnover of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. And yet no one blinks an eye, because in defence those sums mean nothing. Who cares? Another $1 billion. In fact, one surface-to-air missile, Matthew, costs $500,000. Bang, that's it. You could fund an entire orchestra, maybe a whole opera company for that amount of money. You know what, I think we should take the arts, not stick them in defence, stick them in health. Put them in a different portfolio. You wouldn't even notice the cost. What is the cost of the Australia Council budget in Australia? 175 million or something like that? That is the stuff that falls down behind the couch in the health system. A woman comes into a doctor's surgery and she's complaining of depression, of listlessness. Well, give her some list. Give her Franz list. The doctor writes out a prescription for the concert. The promoter claims it back on Medicare, or call it music care, or arts care, whatever. Let's get into it. When we want to do a big event like the Olympics or something, we don't put a whole lot of maths people and computer specialists on stage to dance. We ask orchestras to play, the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, or at the London Games we ask the LSO to play. So I think of the orchestra as a massive instrument, a very important and versatile instrument, and to ask whether it has a future, in some ways as ridiculous as asking whether the clarinet has a future. Of course it does. So just before our final piece, the orchestra finishes off, I'd love to say what a pleasure it's been to work with this great band of young musos who've come here for numerous rehearsals to play all this music for no recompense whatsoever. Ladies and gentlemen, the Queensland Philharmonia. And I'd also like to thank Matthew Schwarz, who runs this orchestra and puts it together. Matthew. And for our final moment of music, Stephen Sondheim, going back to him, once said that in a musical, you need lots of laughs, you need moments of pathos where people might be tearful, but you also need one of those amazing moments where the hair goes up on the back of your neck and somehow you realise the point of being alive, that it's all worth it. And I think Beethoven often does that just towards the very end of his movements, particularly the Fifth Symphony, the Ninth, of course, the Seventh Symphony, and this one, the Sixth. There's this wonderful series of progressions and suspensions. And for all the tricks and gimmicks we've talked about today, when it comes down to it, there will always be, I think, some group of humans who want to come together to play great music, and there will always be people like you who would like to listen to it. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.